Hello, and welcome to World of Warbirds. I'm Brian Pierce. The HE-219 Uhu was a purpose-built, high-powered, cannon-equipped night fighter that was literally designed to hunt the RAF bombers that were plaguing German skies during the Second World War and wrecking German industries and cities. Knowing that, you'd think that the aircraft would have been ordered early and with priority. You'd be wrong. Let's look at this remarkable aircraft and how it didn't end up saving the Third Reich. Now, in these videos, I talk a lot about problems. It might be design problems, or an overall philosophy or strategy problem, or maybe it's an engineering problem, or something to do with materials or production, or the problem of the enemy dropping bombs on your workers' heads, which you know slows things down. But not here. The main problem with getting the Heinkel HE-219 off the ground was people, and mainly not the enemy. Or what's the expression? With friends like this, who needs enemies? The story of the HE-219 is one of rivals and squabbles and disagreements and petty feuds and grudges. The conception of the HE-219 actually started way back in 1938 when aircraft designer Robert Lusser left Messerschmitt and returned to Heinkel. Yes, I said returned. Lusser was an interesting guy with an interesting story who started out working for Heinkel, switched to Messerschmitt, and then went back to Heinkel. He worked on the HE-280 turbojet-powered aircraft, and later on he would work for Fiesler, ending up on a little project known as the V-1 Flying Bomb. After the war, he worked in America with the U.S. Navy, and finally ended up building a better ski binding and running the Lusser Binding Company until his death in 1969. But back in 1938-1939, after returning to Heinkel's company, he was working on a high-speed bomber project that was known in the company as P-1055. Now that you know a little bit about Lusser, you can imagine that he was a pretty forward-thinking guy, and he sure was. This bomber was going to have power in spades using the dual crankcase DB610 power system, which was in reality two conjoined engines. Speed was to be in the 470 miles per hour area with a 2,500 mile range with a 4,410 pound bomb load, which is right into Havilland Mosquito territory. Not only that, this new bomber would have a pressurized cockpit, tricycle landing gear, twin ejection seats, and remotely controlled side-mounted defensive gun turrets. Sounds amazing. The Reich Air Ministry, the RLM, must have wanted them by the thousand. No, they rejected it. And look, you can kind of understand it. The war was going pretty well at that time, and this P-1055 thing sounded like an overly complex, risky, expensive pain in the butt. So, Lusser, who clearly was a go-getter, came back with an offshoot aircraft, the P-1056, which was a purpose-built night fighter with 4 20mm cannon in both the wings and fuselage. You know, kind of like the concept that would become the American P-61 Black Widow. Surely the RLM must have accepted this. No, it was rejected. Why? Well, this is where the people problems come in. The first person we need to look at is Dr. Ernst Heinkel. He was not known for playing well with others, and he was a complicated guy who seemed to be more loyal to aviation and building his airplanes than to the regime he was building them for. And that made him many enemies in the RLM. One of them was Erhard Milch, the Luftwaffe field marshal who was in charge of aircraft construction. But because of his hate for Dr. Heinkel, seemed sometimes to be more interested than the Allies in disrupting Heinkel's production. But by late 1941, there were pressures that you would think would trump petty rivalries. The night bombing campaign by the British Royal Air Force had become so serious that the improvised night fighting Junkers Ju-88 and Messerschmitt Bf-110 needed help. If only someone had had the foresight to design a purpose-built, high-powered, cannon-equipped night fighter. Well, Heinkel grabbed the plans for the P-1056 off the shelf, blew off the dust, and renamed it the P-1060. He shrank the airframe somewhat and exchanged the troublesome DB610 engines with the smaller, but still very powerful DB603 inverted V12 engines. And that was good, because the rejected DB610 power systems were the ones that would end up setting fire to many of the aircraft that they were installed in, especially the HE-177 Greif. Now, it seemed that Heinkel had a slam dunk of a proposal, so much so that he started building and funding the first prototype himself, while he sent the design to the RLM in January 1942. For what was to be certainly just a rubber-stamped acceptance to get this superior night fighter that Germany desperately needed into the air. Nope. Rejected again in favor of updated Ju-88 and Me-210 based designs. Even Josef Hamhuber, the head of the Luftwaffe's night fighter force, really wanted the new Heinkel night fighter, but Erhard Milch, who was in charge of aircraft construction in the RLM, still didn't. And so, there was this tug-of-war going on, and Heinkel was in the middle. But Heinkel kept plugging on with the prototype, and finally, on the 6th of November 1942, it flew. Kamhuber was impressed and wanted it immediately, went around Milch's roadblock, and ordered it into production. Milch was upset, but you're probably thinking that he put his personal feelings aside and realized that Kamhuber, as head of night fighters, probably knew what he needed and accepted the cheeky, courageous decision. Nope. He had Kamhuber fired. But even so, a competition against the Ju-88 night fighter was held in early 1943, and after seeing the results, the Luftwaffe quickly ordered 300 of what was now to be known as the HE-219. Its nickname was Uhu, which is Eagle Owl, and yes, I know the Luftwaffe also had the FW-189, which was also nicknamed Uhu. For either aircraft, I just like the way that the word sounds like the call of an owl. Uhu. So production was started late, and was delayed even more when RAF raids on Heinkel's factories destroyed almost all the blueprints in spring 1943. Oh, if only there had been a superior night fighter up there to help protect German industries and cities. But eventually the first pre-production models were rushed to 1st Squadron, 1st Night Fighter Group at Venlo in the Netherlands. In its very first operational debut on the night of June 11 to 12, 1943, one Uhu shot down 5 British 4-engine bombers, 4 Halifaxes and 1 Lancaster in a mission of about an hour. Supposedly when Milch heard news of this, he said, yeah. He could have done it in any aircraft. Come on, man. How petty can a guy be? The Uhu was installed with Liechtenstein intercept radar, which had a range of about 4 to 6 kilometers, that's 3 to 4 miles, with coverage of a 70-degree arc facing forward. Ground controllers would vector the Uhu into an intercept with the British bombers, where the onboard radar operator would take over, leading his pilot in close enough to shoot visually. Initially, the aircraft had some stability problems, but these were eventually worked out, partly by Heinkel offering a cash prize for the engineer who could solve the issue. Later production versions had longer engine nacelles in which were installed extra fuel tanks, in addition to the 2 20mm cannon under the fuselage and 2 20mm cannon in the wing roots, both with 300 rounds per gun. The Uhu had 2 30mm Schräge Musik cannon aimed 65 degrees from the horizon with 100 rounds per gun for a lethal punch into the belly of a British bomber. The HE-219A6 version was planned to not be a bomber killer, but a mosquito hunter. It was to be a lightened version, giving sufficient speed to hunt down the elusive Mossy. Although the Uhu was shooting down bombers, including on the night of November 2nd to 3rd, 1944, one HE-219 killed 6 bombers in just 12 minutes. But even so, it was just too little and too late, and the night fighter force was suffering from attrition from battle and just operational accidents. HE-219 service manuals even included sections on how to salvage crashed airplanes, and reportedly 6 Uhus were actually assembled in the field from spare parts and used operationally and had no tail numbers as they never came from a factory. But all of these efforts were just not enough for HE-219s and her night-fighting sisters to save the cities of Germany. Although one does have to wonder what might have happened if the work on the aircraft had been allowed to start earlier, and if it could have been allowed to mature into a possible Luftwaffe Mosquito or P-61 in sufficient numbers to make a significant difference. We'll never know. One of my favorite operational names is Operation Lusty, which stands for Luftwaffe Secret Technologie, with the Y from technology. On June 16, 1945, this team took 3 captured HE-219s and flew them to Cherbourg, France, where they were loaded aboard the Royal Navy ship RMS Reaper. Once they arrived in North America, they were flown from Ford Field, Newark, New Jersey to Freeman Field, Indiana for testing. Feuds number 290060 was one of them. After testing, it was crated and stored here and there, and after extensive restoration, it is currently on display at the Udvar Hazy Center. I would love to see her there in person one day. So what happened to all the personalities we have spoken of today? I've already described what designer Lusser did, from working with the U.S. Navy to the space program and then eventually becoming a ski-binding king. What about Dr. Heinkel? After the defeat of Germany, Heinkel was barred from building airplanes, and so, to pay the bills, Heinkel pivoted his company to build something a little less prestigious, but perhaps more useful in post-war Germany. Scooters and mopeds. Also, just like the post-war Messerschmitt company, Heinkel built these small automobiles that are critically cute, the Heinkel version being called the cabin bubble car. Eventually, the ban on building aircraft was lifted, and Heinkel again started making flying machines. This time the F-104 Starfighter under license for the West German Luftwaffe. At that time, they stopped making bubble cars and mopeds, but they kept making scooters right up until 1965. Ernst Heinkel died in 1958 in Stuttgart and was inducted into the International Air and Space Hall of Fame at the San Diego Air and Space Museum in 1981. His company went through a series of mergers that ended up becoming part of Airbus. Erhard Milch was picked up by British No. 6 Commandos in May 1945. He was sentenced to life imprisonment for war crimes, mainly for mistreating POWs and the use of slave labor. His sentence was later commuted to 15 years imprisonment in 1951, and he was paroled in June 1954, and he died in 1972. Josef Kamhuber, the head of the Night Fighter Force, who had been sacked by Milch, did very well indeed. He survived the war, wrote reports and publications for the U.S. Air Force, and he later joined the West German Air Force and became a general in that service. He died on January 25th, 1986. If you like these kind of videos, please hit the super thanks button or join me on Patreon. Until next time.